Trump arrives at the State of the Union address with the lowest approval ratings of his term, and what's happening behind the scenes within the Republican Party could change everything. The numbers are alarming, allies are nervous, and the question no one wants to answer out loud is, how far will this fall? Stay until the end, because this picture is more serious than it appears. Drop a like and subscribe to the channel. When a president arrives at the most important speech of the year, with approval ratings in the low 40s, and in some polls pushing the high 30s, that's not a warning sign. It's a siren. And the issue isn't just the number itself. It's what that number represents in terms of political composition, electoral coalition, and the outlook for the next 2 years. The most revealing data point isn't the overall approval rating, it's what's happening with independent voters. According to recent CNN surveys, Trump's approval among independents sits at around 26%. 26%. For anyone who has followed American politics for decades, that's a number that stops any campaign strategist cold. Independents aren't fanatics for either side. They vote based on their perception of performance, their sense of stability, and concrete results in their day-to-day lives. And when 2/3 of them say the country is worse off than it was a year ago, you have a structural problem, not a passing blip in the polls. What makes this even more significant is the White House's posture toward these numbers. There's an apparent indifference, or at least a public performance of indifference, that rattles even allies within the party. Presidents who govern over long stretches learn that approval polls aren't political vanity. They're a governing thermometer. They're the indicator that defines how much you can negotiate, how much you can mobilize your base, and how willing your fellow party members in Congress are to take risks by your side. Republican Congress members facing re-election in competitive districts are running their own numbers, and those numbers aren't favorable. Seats won in 2024 with thin margins are vulnerable, and when party leadership seems unconcerned about that risk, internal tension doesn't take long to surface. The problem isn't having bad numbers in February of a first term. The problem is the trajectory, and for now, that trajectory points downward. There's an electoral dynamic that every experienced political analyst knows well. Presidential approval is the single most consistent predictive indicator we have for midterm elections. It's not GDP growth. It's not the unemployment rate in isolation. It's the perception that the average voter holds of the sitting president. And that perception is being shaped right now, month by month, decision by decision. Two groups deserve special attention in this analysis. The first is the Hispanic electorate. In 2024, Trump's performance among Latino voters was interpreted by many Republicans as a historic realignment of the electoral map, as if the party had finally found a pathway into a demographic that had voted overwhelmingly Democratic for decades. Recent data suggests that gain is unraveling quickly. Latino support, which appeared solid after November, is reported to have dropped sharply in recent months. The second group is white working-class voters without college degrees. The base that carried Trump in 2016, stayed loyal in 2020, and was decisive in 2024. These voters cast their ballots based on specific economic promises: lower cost of living, more jobs, less financial pressure. And what recent polling shows is that these voters aren't feeling any of those changes in their bank accounts. Inflation, housing costs, food prices, those numbers remain high for the average American family. And when the central promise of a campaign doesn't materialize in everyday life, support starts to erode. The tariff policy deserves specific mention. The sweeping tariff proposals, presented as instruments of industrial protection and trade negotiation, were recently curtailed by the Supreme Court, a significant political and legal setback. And from the perspective of the ordinary voter, tariffs are a cost. They're higher prices on grocery store shelves. They're pressure on the supply chain. The more experienced Republicans know this. And that's why there's growing discomfort within the party over the current economic narrative. Topics like Venezuela, Greenland, and geopolitical disputes may be relevant in terms of foreign policy, but the voter worried about rent is not casting a ballot based on Arctic geopolitics. History has a long memory. And two specific years come up repeatedly in the analyses of those closely watching the current landscape: 1994 and 2006. In both cases, a president who came to power with transformational ambitions watched his electoral coalition fragment, driven by a combination of unpopular policies, a perception of institutional chaos, and an accumulation of controversies that individually might not have carried decisive electoral weight, but that collectively hardened a public rejection. The result in both cases was an electoral wave that swept the ruling party out of its congressional majority. I'm not saying 2026 will be 1994 or 2006. I'm saying the early patterns resemble each other closely enough that serious analysts are making that comparison without hesitation. And what worsens the picture is what's known as the enthusiasm gap, the difference in energy between the two parties. Democrats, according to recent polling and results in local and state elections, are highly mobilized. Republicans are showing signs of lower engagement. When that differential shows up in primary elections or off-year races, its impact can be measured. And recent results have not been favorable to the Republican side. There's also a structural issue that rarely gets the attention it deserves: governing style. Trump has conducted his administration primarily through executive orders and direct executive power, with less emphasis on legislative deal-making and traditional congressional coalition building. That has practical implications. Legislation requires negotiation, compromise, and coalition building inside Congress. Executive orders are reversible, legally contestable, and don't create the same political anchoring as a law passed by the legislature. For a president less focused on personal re-election, that strategy might seem rational. For Congress members who face voters every 2 years, it's a constant source of anxiety. Tonight's State of the Union address will almost certainly be optimistic, assertive, and filled with language of achievement and grandeur. That is the rhetorical signature of this president. But numbers don't bow to rhetoric, and what Republicans behind the scenes actually want to hear isn't a victory declaration. It's a signal that the White House understands the seriousness of what the data shows, and that there's a plan to reverse the trajectory before the electoral damage becomes irreversible. For now, that signal hasn't arrived with enough clarity. If you made it this far, you know the American political landscape is more tense than most people are willing to admit publicly. These numbers matter. These trends matter. And following this story seriously makes a difference. If this kind of political analysis helps you understand what's really going on, drop a like. It goes a long way in helping the channel grow. Subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. And let me know in the comments, do you think Trump will be able to reverse this approval slide before 2026?